Welcome to our first session of the afternoon, Dialogue and Intellectual Humility. I'm Hillary Bogert-Winkler. I'm a PhD candidate in history here at UConn and a graduate assistant with the project. So I'll keep this short and sweet so we can jump right in since we have many people to present this afternoon. And the way this works, we'll have two presentations and we'll save Q&A for the end. So just write down your questions and we'll circle back later. Our first talk, entitled Intellectual Humility and Public Engagement, Some Lessons on Linking Research and Practice, is going to be given by Professor Brendan Kane, Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut, and Dana Francisco Miranda, PhD candidate in philosophy, also from the University of Connecticut.
Hello, everyone. So I've been advised to stand and not in a show of humility. But in terms of the work we do at the Initiative on Campus Dialogues, I just want to do a very quick run through of our many projects over the last 3 years. And then my colleague Brendan Kane will then connect it to our larger work on public humanities. And then hopefully we'll take some great questions. So in terms of the Initiative on Campus Dialogue, it actually began April 22nd of 2016 as a dialogue on campus dialogue. The irony is in the name, of course, but we began this project doing dialogue. And this dialogic work was important not only to bring together the various components of the UConn community, so faculty, staff, undergraduate, graduate students, but also community partners. So we brought in people doing dialogue work in the greater community. So we had Kettering, we had Everyday Democracy, and what we really ran through was, well, how is dialogue a component of the classroom? So how do teachers feel about dialogue in the room? How do students? And then we talked about the greater campus and the greater community. And we took that three questions, those three areas, and really moved forward in our dialogue approach to say, where can we at the Humanities Institute really dive deeply into public humanities, and how can we use dialogue as a tool to facilitate conversations between communities? And so our various components are rather very briefly, we have what we call just our regular meetings. So in our first year in 2017, we had bi-weekly meetings where we brought together various to 20 to 40 people that would come and just really meet with the speaker. They talked about, well, how do you run a dialogue in prison? How do you run a dialogue using like, what are the various ways that dialogue can be incorporated into your classroom, into your community? But we found out that although we love dialogue, we keep doing dialogues, this is our third year of dialogue, that we found that we actually wanted to do something practical in the world. That we wanted public humanity to have the public aspect. So how can we as researchers, humanists, we have philosophers, historians, sociologists, how can we bring our research that is usually just cloistered in the classroom or cloistered in the journal and really solve practical problems in the world? And so we created the ICD fellowships. And we've had 11 fellows in our fellowship teams, and we've done work on various we had some on particularly dialogue in the classroom has been the easiest one to do, but we also had STEM fields where, well, we're talking about agriculture. How do we talk to farming communities about climate change? How do we talk about food deserts and food systems? How do we use youth puppetry, so actual puppets, to create dialogues with students? And again, we've had 11 projects that have continued working and having training in dialogue. So the third component of ICD has been facilitation training. So if we're saying that dialogue is a key component of our university, of the actual atmosphere of the university, we need to know, well, we know that the training is essential. And so we brought in, and luckily we're actually working together, so John Sarrouf, we brought in essential partners to give us training in his model. We brought in Everyday Democracy, the Right Question Institute, and various other civic reflection models to say that we can't just say dialogue is important, we actually have to learn the skills necessary. So these 3 years have been, for me and my various colleagues, a place where we can tell not only faculty that dialogue is important, but train them, bring students, undergraduate staff, and community members and make it free. So luckily with the Templeton Foundation, we've been able to really fund these trainings in dialogue. And very briefly, before I move it on to my colleague Brendan Kane's presentation, that this partnership is always collaborative. So when we talked about the dialogue and campus dialogues, we didn't just say the Humanities Institute is going to be the leader, the one face on campus that is doing this work. We already realized that people who are doing this work is just unrecognized. So how do we enter into a spirit of collaboration with the community that are having dialogues, that want to actually have these conversations? And so our partnerships with the Campus Compact, as well as the CT Civic Ambassadorship, has been a way of saying that UConn is a state institution. It has various campuses. So we have to make sure that we're supporting dialogue and communities wherever we are. So that is very briefly what ICD has been up to for 3 years, except for encounters.
All right, thanks. Radio, thanks folks. Let me just very quickly say, in addition to what Michael said this morning, thank you so much to everyone for doing such amazing work over the last 3 years. It's been an unbelievable privilege to work with you all, even if this is kind of in the background as we watch the amazing things that you have been doing. And so really, thanks again. Two other super quick things. This is going to be a sort of disciplinary moment, a moment of interdisciplinary difference, because I'm an historian. We print things and we read them. So I'm going to try not to do that too much, but I got no slides and I got the text and I feel warm. And one thing about intellectual humility too, I got a lot to be humble about, especially in this crowd. I'm a Renaissance Reformation historian. I have no idea what I'm doing. So this has been 3 years of utter mystery, which has been fun. So let me just do a little segue from what Dana has said. And say that, one of the things that really got us thinking about what became Encounters was thinking about the political unrest that we'd seen around the country, places obviously like Missouri, more closely Yale, and so on and so forth, where there were these outbursts of tension and polarization around cultural issues, and how from place to place to place, colleges, universities decided the way to repair the fabric was to have a dialogue. And we're like, oh, that's pretty fascinating, to have a dialogue. And we had no idea what that was about. But it was interesting that everyone did it. But what was also interesting was that most of the institutions that did it had one. And it could be a variety of different sorts, the town hall or something like that. And after that, it's like, we had a dialogue, hug it out, life's good, right? And we're done. And so we thought, if it's so important that everyone does it, why only do it once? It should be incorporated more closely into the fabric of the university. But since this is a public university, it should be more closely integrated into the broader community of which we are part. And that supports us, and thus Encounters. And you can see some pictures sort of going in the background. So if I bore you, you can look at the pictures. But it's only for 8 more minutes, so I think you got this one. All right, so I'm going to do 4 things, tell you something about what Encounters is, secondly about why we do it, third about its relationship to intellectual humility, and then fourth, where are we now? So what? It is a structured dialogue model. Right? So there would be a head moderator, and then there are individual tables that are facilitated. So the facilitators at each table. And it is created specifically to make a place for academic knowledge and scholarly expertise. There are many different models for dialogue work, Essential Partners being one of the truly fantastic global best. And we have learned a lot from these folks. But we wanted to make one that had specifically a place for institutions of higher learning. It attempts to then wed the benefits of the sort of process-driven aspects of dialogue with the content-driven aspects of the academic lecture. It is a radically collaborative undertaking. It started with public partners. We sat down with Hartford Public Library, we sat down in Wadsworth Athenaeum and said, what are we going to do? And we started collaboratively, and every single project that we do is done collaboratively. You can imagine the hilarity that is, but nevertheless, it seems to work out. And the goal is conversation. It is not debate. It is not deliberation to action, which leads me to number 2, which is why. And I think one of the, most fundamentally, Encounters is about the skills and experience of speaking across difference. And sometimes that difference is contentious. So we've had conversations about matters political, but sometimes it's just simply a matter of asymmetries of knowledge. It's about something historical, or it's about something aesthetic or philosophical. But in whatever the case, right, active listening is crucial to us in encounters, as you can imagine, and sort of the classic things, like speaking is important. Active listening is a way to be a check on over-speaking, and for people like me, that's important. But reflection, and reflection in public is absolutely crucial. And so encounters is truly one of the most awkward experiences anyone has ever experienced. Thank you, Essential Partners, for getting us. So we always have to tell people, like, embrace the awkwardness. It's going to be ugly in here. All right. Secondly, in terms of why, it was a way for scholars to interact with their communities in new ways. So again, as Dana said, right, we tend, and I know there are a lot of different institutions represented in this room today, but certainly from a Research One university, the way in which we typically interact with the world is through the peer-reviewed journal, article, or the book, or the lecture. Right? Sometimes we might have a more kind of popular mode, like the podcast or the popular press. And we wanted to move beyond that yet further and have more dynamic interaction, like get in the room, start chatting with folks, right? Third, came out of Humanities Institute, so we were particularly interested in getting people working in the humanities and the more humanistic side of the social sciences, or even the hard sciences, out into the world. Sorry, scientists in the room, but the stress on STEM is worrying and problematic to me in certain ways, in part because so many of the questions that just kind of drive polarization and tear communities apart are cultural ones, about meaning, belonging, and so on and so forth. So we have all these people who are scholars sitting up here, in the woods on Horse Barn Hill, working on this for their entire freaking lives, and communities fighting about this stuff, especially when it comes to election time, bring them together. And thus, it was a way to think about the place of the scholar and the place of the college, university, and the wider society. A way to humanize scholarship so you can see the person doing it, you can have access to it. The number of people who said to us, like, oh yeah, well, like, I kind of know where Stores is, but I'm not going there. I feel really uncomfortable, and I don't know what you, like, eggheads are doing. Like, well, hey, here we are, and we have a lot to be humble about, so let's have at it. And in that sense, it was also an aspect of accountability, right? Like, actually, I pay you. What the hell do you do? And so that's been really interesting. How does this relate to IH? One, we didn't know what we were doing, so we learned from people like John, and we learned from Central Partner, or from Everyday Democracy and the Kettering Foundation, and so on and so forth. Two, again, this is an exercise in radical collaboration and kind of small d democratic. All of the programming that we do is done so that it's done against the backdrop of other public programming that's out there. So like, right, what do you got? What are your needs? What's your community needs? What do you all want to hear? Fine, let's work it out that way. It's ownable, right? So you can go through this website, like you don't know who kind of runs it, because that's kind of part of the point. The idea is you can take encounters and you can go and you can use it and you can own it and it can be part of what you do. Right? It's not, encounters brought to you by Brennan Kane, or Dana or whatever it is. But the process is key. You show up, you have some stuff to read, it's pre-circulated, and you have 90 minutes within rounds in which you talk about and engage a subject. And random people show up, and here are some pictures of random people, right? And you know that you're dealing with an asymmetry of knowledge, and so you get people 90 minutes to talk based on documents, or exhibitions, 90 minutes. Their confidence builds on the subject. But then we also bring in experts from the university or from the community, and they just simply take part. And at the end, so for those of you who know something about dialogues, right, it tends to end with a share out. So what we do is, instead of doing the classic share out, like, hey, this is what we were talking about at our table, each table determines a question collaboratively. And we bring the experts up to the front of the room who then have to do a Q&A about a subject they know something about in a situation in which they've had no control of the discourse, and hilarity ensues. So it levels the playing field. Community is more confident, academics are less confident, and off we go. All right, so in the minute and a half I have left, and it's also driven by a theory that everybody stands to learn more from new unexpected questions and interactions, and indeed encounters, thus the name. And by the way, Dana came up with that name. It was originally called The Incubator, which was so pathetic, it was awesome. Oh, how things grow. Okay, so where are we now? super quick, in a minute. We continue to tweak by experience, and we've had some really funny, like Matt Gregory and I actually like switched things one time, like in the middle of something, like we're not doing that for round 2. But we also hand out surveys, right? So we continue to build. And thus we've written a handbook. We have a handbook. We can give it to you. We can send it to you electronically. You can do it wherever you want. And it's a draft. We'll continue building. We're in new places. So new schools around the country, other universities, colleges picking it up, but also public institutions, libraries, museums, so on and so forth, but also high schools. And the Department of Education is actually starting to sort of spread it out. So the person who runs social studies, they have a plan for the entire state. And we have undergrad interns who are doing their own encounters. And we have somebody who's going back to their high school to do it, which is going to be insane. So wish us luck. As Dana said, we have a train-the-trainers model, which we're doing. We are really interested in using encounters as a way to try to get dialogic exchange more into the classroom. So thinking about this as an aspect of kind of pedagogical approach, but also uptake of information and learning, and that's going to be the segue into our friends. But then I have, in my last couple seconds, I'm going to reveal to you the reels of dark night in my soul, which is, does this work show up, is it legible at all when it comes time for PTR, merit, or graduation if you're a graduate student, or are people like me wasting their time? Thank you. All right. Yeah, I'm always Eeyore, so there you go.
I'll welcome our next, posse for their presentation. So there are 5 of them, and this is in no particular order. The first is John Sarrouf, who is Director of Program Development and Strategic Partnerships with Essential Partners. Jill DeTemple is at Southern Methodist University. Lauren is Bartol, is from Endicott College. Betsy Hayes is from Bridgewater State. I can't read my own handwriting. And Jonathan Garlick is from Tufts. So there are lots of you, and I want to give you as much time as you need. So go for it.
We'll time ourselves because that's how we do things in dialogue. So thank you to Brendan and Dana for talking a little bit about what we mean by dialogue. We thought we'd start there a little bit with the origin story of what was Public Conversations Project, now Essential Partners, back in the late 80s. A group of family therapists were watching television, one of those debate programs where there are 2 people on one side of the moderator and 2 people on the other side of the moderator. The moderator asks a question like, what do you think about abortion? Right? And in about 2 minutes, it's about 2 minutes and 20 seconds, we can link you to the video, we still have it. It devolves into 4 people just screaming at each other. Right? And family therapists are looking at this and say, oh, this looks familiar. We've seen this in our therapy sessions, and we know what to do about it. Right? We see that there are patterns here, and that those are self-sustaining patterns, if not interrupted in some way. And we can interrupt it. We can interrupt it with narrative. We can interrupt it with a different kind of inquiry, with reflection, with space and time for people to think about it, with some structures. And so they begin to experiment with that. And they come up with the idea that if you can change the way that people speak to each other, you can change the relationships that they have. Change the relationships, you can change the community that they live in and what's possible in that community. And that every single choice you make as a person who constructs spaces to talk will invite certain ways of being and discourage others. Whether you make the choice or not, it will invite certain ways of being and discourage others. So we tested it, did it, have done it for years all over the world. And when this grant came along and the question was, could we invite intellectual humility into the classroom? And could we discourage a level of arrogance or all the other words that people use for whatever the opposite of intellectual humility is? We wanted to understand that. And then it came along conviction. Can we support people in the development of their convictions? So I went and found a group of colleagues from around the country who were asking that question in different ways at Southern Methodist University, at Tufts, at Bridgewater College in Virginia, at Endicott, and at Gordon College. It's not represented here. And they decided to join us in asking that question. Can we create space for intellectual humility, to draw that into the culture of the community, to the culture of the classroom.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by intellectual humility, and I am a philosopher, but I'm the only philosopher in the group, so I got overrode, and so we started thinking about intellectual humility in a slightly different way. What we're really interested in, I mean, I think we're all interested in figuring out how intellectual humility can help us convey knowledge, right? Whether it's in the classroom like we're doing or whether it's in the public writ large. So our specific task was to ask about how we can use dialogue to cultivate intellectual humility. So first of all, we had wanted to sort of reflect on and make some tweaks to and some present questions to some of the standard definitions of intellectual humility. So the first one by Whitcomb and Baddeley, I know, is really this emphasis on taking ownership for what one doesn't know. And while that makes a lot of sense, we found that in the classroom, there are a lot of things I don't know. But I don't know about black holes, but the fact that I'm not learning about them, does that make me not intellectually humble? So we needed something else to sort of, another piece to make it meaningful for students to think about humility in relationship to knowledge in the classroom. So then we were considering Alfano, and I know he's here, but I don't know who, oh, hi. His 4 core definitions of humility used for measurement, because we were interested in measuring this. His was open-mindedness, intellectual modesty, corrigibility, and engagement. And again, we wanted to do some tweaking here. Based on what we had observed already doing dialogue both inside and out of the classroom, we really wanted to find some habits, I'll talk about those in a minute, that really communicated what we thought intellectual humility was about. So we preserved open-mindedness and engagement. Those are really 2 crucial components of intellectual humility. And then we decided to use tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty rather than corrigibility. And we started focusing on curiosity rather than modesty. So we thought that, why did we change those a little bit? First of all, we think of dialogic classrooms as really cultivating a space in which habits of intellectual humility can be practiced. So we're sidestepping the issue of whether it's an attitude, because we want to try to get away from this model in which knowledge means having a piece of information coming to an individual mind and changing belief, which sometimes works and most of the time it doesn't. So how do we change minds in a different way? And that was sort of my leading question in the previous session, to think about trust. So relationships, connections to others, connections to the content, connections to meaning are all crucial for students to learn. And also to be able to learn, again, not in this passive way where they're just ingesting information, but where they're really creating meaning themselves. So part of our emphasis was then to use some of the approaches and tools from the Central Partners approach to dialogue, and to see how that really got students engaged in the classroom. Again, our key was to create spaces where people felt connected to the ideas, because this is a college classroom, but also connected to one another, because relationships are important, and then connected to meaning writ large. So meaning is, there's going to be some of it there, but some of it's going to be created, because if students don't create that for themselves, they're not going to, it's not going to have any impact in their lives, and when they go beyond the classroom, they're certainly not going to take that with them. So dialogic classrooms that are really connected classrooms, where students, again, connect not only just to ideas, but to historical meanings, social meanings, individual meanings, and students feel a responsibility to take that knowledge as something that's relevant to them beyond the classroom. So in this way, a lot of people talk about engaged learning and active learning, but we really see this as a very strong and promising model for developing a truly active learning approach. And I should also say that the element of conviction became very important to us, Because while some people teach on campuses where there are fires and that you use dialogue to put out fires, others of us teach at campuses that are doused in water, where students are incredibly sleepy, and I probably couldn't bring any topic or show any film clip that would get them excited about anything. And so one of my tasks is really to help, humility? No, don't be humble. I want conviction, not that they're opposites, but we found that dialogue really not only promotes humility, but it's a great way of getting students to feel convicted, to understand their convictions, the values that underlie their beliefs, to strengthen them, maybe question them, and also just give them the confidence. That's what my students need. They need the confidence to be able to speak in class about anything. And so this dialogic approach has been very effective in both helping us think about humility, but also conviction. And then again, a way as thinking about engagement, both in the classroom and beyond, and hopefully teaching them to be civically minded, to be good citizens as they continue on in their life. So I don't really pass it.
That's what So I'm going to give you a little vignette of what a dialogic classroom actually looks like, what it feels like, and through the lens of a course that we teach at Tufts called Science in the Human Experience. So I'm a scientist, research lab, I do stem cell research, work on complications of diabetes, so I'm humbled every day in my lab. And I thought, wow, what an incredible opportunity to be invited in with this amazing team of individuals from very different disciplines. So the question that we were asking is, how can we implement the principles of humility and conviction and dialogue in the classroom where we're teaching science to students from a range of disciplines? So as we already discovered this morning, science issues are complex, science issues are uncertain, science issues are divisive. I see some of you shaking your heads. Our intention is to use the dialogic classroom, implement dialogue to teach our students how to unravel the complexity, how to confront the uncertainty, and most importantly, how to speak across differences of values, beliefs, and lived experiences. So the students do the work creating a community through dialogue to explore these divisive science issues, and the science becomes the lens through which they explore their own identities. And I would make the case that any discipline, if we can do it through the lens of these science issues, you can do it through the lens of any issue. So what we do is, we frame these courses through a new emerging discipline that we call civic science. And what civic science asks us and asks our students is, how do we bring divisive science issues, polarizing divisive science issues into our civic lives, so we, the public, can make well-informed, evidence-based, but values-driven choices. Communal choices, personal choices, collective choices. But it's really about the values-driven piece, and that's where dialogue around conviction and humility comes to play. So the intention of civic science is really to think about ways to humanize, perhaps even revolutionize, the science conversation by creating these dialogic moments where students have the opportunity to balance having an open mind with holding strongly held convictions around these science issues. So what are some of these science issues? The Flint, Michigan water crisis, that opens up a conversation, a dialogue about race. And before each of these classes, we have a dialogue. So essentially the dialogue is wrapped around the curricular content. DNA ancestry testing, that's a dialogue about identity. Genetically modified food, that's about making choices in the face of uncertain harms. Planned Parenthood controversy, that's a dialogue we have about the value of the human embryo. The opioid addiction and epidemic, it's a conversation about how to build resilient communities that might support individuals that are in recovery. And gene editing of human embryos is about whether or not we should be manipulating the embryos in the future that might also lead to human enhancement. So I'll just give you two quick examples of how we do this. One is a dialogue about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. The course content is to prepare our students to understand not just the failings of science in that community, but how systemic racism created the Flint, Michigan water crisis. So the question that we use in dialogue before our class on the Flint, Michigan water crisis is, what were your formative experiences with people of other racial groups before you came to Tufts University, and how do these experiences impact your views about race today? That dialogue and the feedback we get from it is a student tells us that it builds an understanding, it builds an empathy, an understanding of the diverse experience, so students, when they talk about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, can meet each other where they are. Our dialogue about the value of the human embryo seeks to deepen an understanding of how different perspectives about human life and when it begins and what it means to be a person and what personhood means, by reflecting on the lived experiences that inform those views. The dialogue question was, share your convictions and beliefs about the value of the human embryo in light of the view that human embryos are vulnerable and need to be protected. And the outcome was, in the face of very diverse perspectives and opinions, not only about the embryo, but about the fetus, people share these religious beliefs, deeply held convictions, and keep an open mind to alternative points of view and alternative ways of being. So our intention is to explore the humanizing aspects of these science disciplines. How do you bring science to life? You bring science to life through dialogue and wrap it around the curricular content. You integrate class content with this reflective learning and teach students that they can hold their deeply held convictions. We're not asking them to relinquish their convictions. In fact, we're asking them to hold those strongly held convictions and to keep an open mind in the face of those convictions. And ideally, we want to look at emerging technologies and explore how these technologies are going to engage communities in dialogue. And some of those communities are at the margins of our society. How do we engage those communities in ways that we can think about the historical harms that science and medicine have done to those individuals and yet engage them in those conversations? That's the practice of true citizenship and democracy. And finally, we developed this really cool inclusive assessment rubric that incorporates a lot of Michael Lynch's components and a lot of the Alfano components. And we asked the students to self-assess how effectively they are incorporating these elements of holding conviction and balancing with humility. And we asked them to self-assess, and here you can see one of those right here. Have you shared your opinion on a science issue with humility by balancing your strong beliefs with openness to new ideas, contradictory information, or being wrong? They self-assess, and we reviewed that self-assessment with them, and that way we get a sense of what is making it possible for them to do that. So finally, the intention of dialogue in this classroom space is to allow students to instill a sense of wonder, not only about the science, but about each other, and dialogue is a wonderful means to achieve that goal.
So it is my privilege to tell you about how we went about taking this model and making it a bigger thing and something we could research. So the way that our project was structured is this. We started out with classroom observations on several of our campuses where we would look at how things are being taught as is. Right? So we got some faculty to do this thing and open up to us. And then based on that and these practices and a lot of conversation, we developed workshops that we then offered to faculty on each of our campuses. Usually we were getting, I think, about 20 faculty, and sometimes larger. In case of Betsy's, it was hooked into a first-year seminar program, so she had a few more, where we were trying to teach faculty how to have a dialogic classroom. We had faculty from all over the place. My university was a good example. We had everybody from counseling programs to our engineering school, a couple of lawyers, folks from our art school, and then all over the liberal arts and hard sciences. Right. And so we spent 2 days, and what we were doing is, first of all, getting folks oriented into the essential partners model of dialogue. So people would learn about neurobiology, they would learn about how dialogues work, we would run people through a structured dialogue. So think something you can have a timer and you pass it around. But then we would also talk about the pedagogical aspects. So generally it would be John doing a training hooked up with a faculty member so that we could hit everybody's concerns in the classroom about what we were trying to do. And as we went along, we learned a few things. To get faculty tapped into what it is they want to do, we realized that one of the purposes of these workshops couldn't just be to teach dialogue. We needed to ask faculty and have them reflect deeply about their purposes in using dialogue in a classroom. So towards the end, we'd also developed a worksheet so faculty could think deeply about this. We now have a dialogue toolkit that you can access at the Essential Partners website online.
Yes, thank you. And so we would, again, usually between a day and a half or 2 days of running faculty through this. And then the way the research went that Betsy's about to talk about is we would then survey the students who had been in a dialogic classroom about those experiences. So a couple of the things, I'll just finish by telling you some things we've learned to emphasize by the end of this process. One is that language of invitation. If you can create a classroom culture around a language of invitation, that's when we're going to get a lot of engagement for students who would then report back that they felt engaged. These dialogic moments, that's another phrase that we started talking about. You don't need the full-on gun dialogue or civic science dialogue. That you can start a class day instead of lecturing by simply asking students, think of a moment when. So I teach religious studies. We're talking about insider outsider issues, and I just asked students to think about a moment they'd crossed over, right, between being an insider and outsider, or just a time when you knew you weren't at home anymore. We're teaching faculty these smaller techniques such that they can create a classroom that is this culture of curiosity. We're starting to think about a curiosity engine, where students pick it up as the culture, make it their own, and move themselves along. And it turns out this is a really teachable skill. It also turns out, and I'll finish with this, that it's even more teachable if we have more time. So while our classrooms were based on roughly, our workshops were roughly a day and a half to 2 days, we did get some other funding from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion and had 12 religious studies faculty using this model, but with an extra day and a half. And they have been able to take this and do amazing things. Because we were really able to move them into those deep convictions that they hold as teachers. One of our takeaways from the project is it isn't just about the students' convictions, it's about faculty convictions. Right? And allowing faculty enough time and breathing space and room to play that they can create those and then pass them along to students as well. So that's one way we're working on the next stage of this research. But I'll have Betsy talk about research.
Stand here because we don't have much time left. And I'm going to skip how we managed the methodology. If you want to ask about that, awesome. But I'm going to really just give you the takeaways, the key things that we've learned from the data. One is that faculty are very worried about losing time to cover content. If there's some reason why faculty are like, no dialogue in the classroom, because they don't want to sacrifice content. And what we learned from the students is that for students, it's dialogue that gets them into the content. That if you want your students to access the text, if you want your students to access really difficult abstract concepts, dialogue is the entry point for them. Dialogue is also the way they feel like they're seen as whole persons in the classroom space. So the other thing that we see from the data is that students feel a greater sense of belonging. And by belonging, we mean a number of things. This sense of being seen, this sense of being recognized for being complex human beings, but also a sense of trust and a connectedness in the community. So there's a relationship to social capital. I'm going to just read you a couple of really poignant, I think, takeaways from the students. One student notes, I feel more comfortable participating in class and less defensive when other students disagree. And because I learned more from my fellow students about their views, I now feel less competitive with them in other classes. So one of the key things that we started hearing from faculty is that as faculty went through this training and enacted this frame of mind, this paradigm shift in the classroom, that they thought less about getting students to talk and more about getting students to listen. And I think it's that shift to listening that's been most profound for us. Thank you.
Probably less than 30 seconds I have left. The vision of this is that it becomes a movement across the country where anybody can access this in the way that Brendan talked about it in Counters. That people can get on this website that we've just put up. We're adding videos now. There are worksheets and ways of doing this. We would like to see dialogic campuses all over and professors teaching each other through a community of practice that really spans the country. and the globe.
So now we have time, about 20 minutes for questions for anybody on the panel. So we'll start with Lainey and then we'll move over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is a question really for the team from, I'm not sure if I remember, is it central or essential?
Essential.
Essential, right. Yeah, so a couple of you mentioned about the dialogic model being a way to instill a sense of wonder or a culture of curiosity, right? And I was wondering whether you had any data that sort of speaks to that being the case, or whether it's kind of primarily anecdotal, that that's what you observed or the teachers were observing, or what exactly this culture of curiosity is looking like, and how the dialogic method is creating that in a way that something else might fail to.
Yeah, so it's probably easiest to sort of think about it in two ways. So we had, as Jill mentioned, a survey that the students took at the end of the course in which the faculty member had enacted these practices, enacted this kind of shift. And yes, so there were questions that were about willingness to ask my classmates questions, willingness to speak, or willingness to not speak. And then we sort of parsed out when and why people were more willing to speak and when and why people were choosing not to speak, and willingness to ask questions when I disagreed. So we were trying to get at that issue of really hard to sort of think about ways we could get students to tap into those moments of curiosity. But it was a survey that was both quantitative in its structure and qualitative. So we asked them to describe the dialogue, and then we asked them to, after some of the more Likert scale questions, to give us some explanations. So we used both their more descriptive responses to coincide with the survey data. One of the things that we were most fascinated by was the fact that it didn't seem to matter if they identified that they agreed with their classmates in a group. If we controlled for agreement, all the other indicators that they were more willing to speak, more willing to ask questions, more willing to disagree, were still significant. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. So this is primarily for Brendan and Dana, but I'd be interested in any of your thoughts on this. Brendan, you mentioned that in encounters the model was a model of conversation rather than debate or deliberation. And I can see why you would pick conversation rather than debate, which maybe is about winning. But I guess I wanted to hear your thoughts about why I prefer conversation than deliberation, where I take it deliberation is aimed at some kind of practical end or some decision. I know there's some evidence that when people are working together towards some common end, that can facilitate trust building. So I guess I wanted to hear more about what you think some of the distinctive merits of conversation are.
So in enacting the actual encounters model, one thing that we found out very quickly through feedback and surveys were that many people wanted to have a conversation, have a dialogue about a particular issue to then enact their conviction. So yes, I want to talk with someone about climate change or gun control, so then I can learn more about what I actually want to do out in the world.
Okay.
And so one thing that we stress very heavily at encounters is that before we can even get to the action steps, is that we haven't even had a conversation with one another. So if we're stressing like what actions can we take on climate change, that already presumes that everyone in the room has a maybe a common grounding or at least a cohesive position on that. And what we really wanted to do, at least in the beginning, well, how do I get someone in the room that doesn't agree that climate change even exists to talk to someone that does? And so that's really where the encounters model stresses the dialogue, just hearing, that listening, actively listening the other person's position. So then you can always have more dialogues, and that's why we're in 3 years now, and we're going to keep building upon this because you can't just have one dialogue, even on this issue. especially for different communities. So that's just why we stress it.
And that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that. I mean, we've done professional development with high school teachers, and we have a whole kind of slideshow about distinctions between debate and deliberation. And we're not here to say that those other modes of interaction are unimportant, but as Dana says, they operate in particular kinds of ways, and the connected actions in particular kind of ways that conversation is not necessarily. And it's for us, really, it's about bringing people to the table who simply don't have the experience of coming to the table to talk about something that is just going to get them so worked up. But then in terms of deliberation, and part of our responsibility, we think, part of the responsibility as a public institution, like our particular place in this, is to try to seed those kinds of actions, and this as a mode of community building and thus service, to the folks who support us at this stage.
So can I just mention that beautiful word, common grounding? I want to distinguish that from common ground. So common grounding is dialogic. Common ground is deliberative. So common grounding is the intention we bring. We're grounded in the intention to listen, to understand, to ask questions of curiosity. That's dialogic. That's the grounding. That's the commonality. It's grounded in those intentions. And the common ground is what we might find when we do a deliberative process, which is how to find the best possible solution for the largest number of people in the room. But if you approach dialogue and say, we're here to find common ground, you may end up being disappointed. It's really not meant to solve all the problems, not meant to solve any problems. So keep that distinction in mind. I think it's such a beautiful language, that common grounding is dialogic.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the point that Brendan kind of threw away at the end about getting credit for this, and I wanted to kind of reflect in the other group as well. So I have some facilitation training, and occasionally I'll go and do peer reviewing of my colleagues, and I kind of point out how they could improve, get good better conversations going in the classroom. And they appreciate that, but they don't want to spend time training because they want to be spending time on their research, or they're a bit afraid of opening up that space because it's kind of almost like a private space. So I'm just thinking about the structures that are in place within universities, either to actually develop the kinds of projects you're doing or the kind of projects you're doing. It seems to me that it's running counter to the kind of, particularly in the UK, with the kind of bureaucratisation of universities, where actually we're spending less and less time thinking about what we're doing with students, and more time thinking about achieving particular. I'm trying to think what the key performance indicators and stuff. One of which isn't conversation. So I'm just interested about your thoughts about, because you guys are clearly very committed, and I know lots of other teachers who are very committed and they spend their time doing it, but most lecturers aren't. I'm just thinking, you're talking about 2 days wasn't enough. 2 days talking about teaching? A couple of hours would be great. So I'm just interested about, because how you're talking about a movement and things, but how do we create that space? Because otherwise it's still going to be a very niche activity amongst a small group of people. So I think that's both within and without.
I think you should answer that question.
Well, it's interesting because I would say that how you do it depends on the cultural context of your campus. So we had actually originally brought essential partners in to train our students to do dialogues. I mean, I love what you guys are doing in Connecticut because it resonates. But our faculty looked at it and said, they could do that extracurricularly, but we can't do that in the classroom. But it was our students who are our best ambassadors, because faculty started saying, well, I have a difficult dialogue I need to run in the classroom, so I'll bring in those students who are trained and they'll run the dialogue. And then they watched it happen in their classrooms and they started to think, well maybe I could do this. One thing I think is really fascinating that we've been hearing, particularly in the faculty interviews, is that faculty sort of have this belief there are magic classrooms. And these magic classrooms that they have in their head when it will all just go, right? The dialogue and the discussion will just happen. They're convinced that, because they remember their own experience as graduate students, I think. or something. They have this vision.
I think they made it up.
Some utopic dream. But it's not magic, right? It is, in fact, really highly structured and takes a lot of time and energy on the front end to prep for. And this notion of structure is really key. So giving faculty time to talk that through, to practice it, to share best practices with one another is critical. And so
That's not a culture in many universities, is
Yeah.
what it says. You know, most departments don't
Right.
have that culture.
right?
Yeah, maybe I can just real quick.
Yeah.
So this is so countercultural to my university, I can't even begin to explain. But it's starting to get picked up for the student engagement. We are flunking NESI surveys all over the place. That National Student Survey of Student Engagement. Because we had been trying to handle student engagement outside of the classroom. And our students came back and said, "You're just eating up my time." Right? And so all of a sudden there's been a complete shift from my administration, which had been actually sort of trying to shut some of this down, to realizing that having faculty do this and getting them embedded in this gradually, and they're certainly not mandating a training, although other campuses have, is actually good for the institution. And it's good for the bottom line.
And if you want to speak to administrators, where you go is this concept of belonging. Because if you want to talk about retention and retaining students at your institution, which was a lot of the driver for a lot of administrators at various institutions, this is huge.
And one word, sorry, money. So, I mean, we were able to do the training because we had this grant. So now when I'm going back to other colleges, they say this is great, but we can't afford it. So, money.
Different actually from what Betsy had to say. I mean, in the institution that we're at, this has very little legibility when it comes time for tenure and promotion, merit, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that Dana was talking about with ICD is, look, we were absolutely committed to trying to, at least experiment to find ways in which one's research expertise could have some effect in the world through dialogic process, broadly construed, and so it would be somewhat legible as research, right? And then it tried to make that case. And actually the construction of the handbook and the theory of encounters is in many ways analogous to a peer-reviewed article. It is a thing, it has been peer-reviewed, you can read it, it is critiquable, so on and so forth. So in that way, it's a little, it kind of makes me a little bit sad in the sense that we kind of wrote an article in a way, do you know what I mean? In order to satisfy the metrics of a Research One university. But then I think sort of connecting back to, what Betsy was saying is that, if we can see dialogic methods and models as way to sort of as ways to educate, but also to benefit our own research, and thus perhaps kind of stand as research outputs in and of themselves, then we'll be in a different world. But we are not at that world yet, and I thought about going up for full promotion, in part through the work that I'd done as one of the team members building the new model, right? And one of the other pieces is a big digital humanities project that I do on kind of matters, grammatical and linguistic and so on and so forth. And, have been cautioned that would be an unwise choice. And so thus, what's the lesson? I should have written some articles, or I should have just finished the next book. And, there's a lot of work to be done.
All right, we've got 5 minutes and four people in the queue, so we're gonna go quickly.
Do you have any ideas about how to scale this up onto the internet? And I mentioned that for 2 reasons. One is it'd be nice to see this reach not just current students, but former students. And the second is that if the faculty member wants to get this going in their class without taking up class time, If you had it available on the internet, they could send their students to do the dialogue in advance and still have all the time they want to cover content.
Dialogue can be used as a lab, that lab time or discussion time, so you can do that, but you still have to have some trained facilitators. Yeah, there still needs that structure, otherwise it's not sure the effectiveness, but we're trying to put this stuff on the web, we're trying to get it out there, webinars in small ways.
And I would follow up, a piece we didn't talk about is the absolutely essential component of reflection, and a lot of that does happen online. So some of my students they'll have the dialogue and they walk out of there after their 45 minutes or an hour and 20, and they're sort of sure something happened. But without that reflective piece, which is often done on discussion boards or journal entries or something like this, they aren't able to put it together. And so that does happen outside of class. It gets them thinking about my class when I'm not seeing them, which is really helpful for my purposes. But that's also where they're actually reaching to each other and starting to have conversations out. So they will take each other to coffee now to kind of continue conversations. So the idea that it's only happening in the classroom, I think, isn't true. And there is some actual virtual content as well, although on the other end.
And I just add rather briefly that we do plan for our encounters model to have a website where every encounters we've run, so about 28 over 3 years, are available online. So you have the readings, the actual slide presentations, the handbook that would guide you through the actual structure. But you also have to have the component of, well, what are your actual community relations? How are you finding the specialists to actually come in and have these conversations? And who are going to be the facilitators? So the head moderator that runs through that full 2 hours, the people in the actual conversation that say, well, can we bring it back to the text? And then that goes back to the original question. You actually need the time and energy and resources to train people. So the list I ran through in the very beginning, which is like, it's a slog. Like ICD does this, it does this, because you need those practical components to even get to a good dialogue.
So I would just raise one other point of scale, and that is the question, can we do this in a class? We described a class of 25 students. Can we do it in a classroom with 300 students? The answer is yes. And the way to do it is you can embed dialogic principles and break students up into dyads. They turn to each other, have these conversations. You do it all the time. They report out. So it's another question of scale, and it is possible to bring these dialogic principles and questions of humility and conviction into larger classrooms.
It's actually it's a different skill doing it in 25 and doing it in 300. There's a new set of skills you've got to learn.
It's a different skill set, but it's the same principles.
Yeah.
Teaching the dialogic principles, and that's what they're engaging across.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been fascinating. I have a question for the dialogical project. You have told us a little bit about how you run the classroom. Are you having guidelines? How did you design methods of assessment? So have you changed the way you assess students' learning, given the way that, and if the answer is yes, have you seen, that they've done better, so to speak?
So maybe I can speak.
And if the answer is no, you're using traditional methods, have they done better?
So traditional methods, my students do better. The one tension is with research papers, where I have to remind them that this is a case where you need to persuade me. Because usually we're talking about questions of curiosity as opposed to persuasion, and then I have to remind them that this is actually where persuasion is really good. Persuade me, you're right about this thing. But for assessment, I have done some assessment that's directly related to the dialogue because I got a grant for an ethics project where I'm teaching students to think ethically using dialogic practices, and I do have to assess for that, and that's done with a separate essay question. And then we also have in-class discussions where they sort of assess each other. How are we doing as a class? How's the culture coming? But honestly, my students, their GPAs are up since I've started this, and it's because they're coming to class. Frankly, my attendance is better, and they just get into, I teach the most arcane 19th century religious studies literature. And they are actually reading it. They're reading it till the end of the semester. And so even on a standard assessment scale, first of all, nobody's dropping anymore either. I also have more students, unfortunately, at this time of the year. Can't get them to leave. A lot of grading. So I have seen, by those measures, an uptick And it's not because my students are particularly smarter than they were 5 years ago. But then I have also embedded some other assessments that are more geared at, are you doing well with your open-mindedness and your conviction and the things you said you wanted to be as a student? And are you doing well with those ethical convictions? I don't know if anybody else has tried.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. This is absolutely wonderful. I have a question that I'm personally often struggling with. So it's not a critical question, it's really a very curious question. And that has to do with the data that you collected through the surveys. And if I remember correctly, you asked, are you more willing to ask questions, right? That's just one example. And for me, often when I think about intellectual humility, yes, there are certain behaviors that can be associated with it, but then there are a whole lot of personal differences already, right? But then I'm thinking about cultural differences, and especially with regard to questions, and then it becomes really interesting. So I'm wondering if you looked at the cultural composition, the backgrounds in your classrooms, and if you saw patterns there maybe that might not necessarily have to, so, in other words, can that change the results to some degree? Because, so as an example, I could imagine somebody not being willing to ask questions because in my culture I don't ask questions, but I'm very curious, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually made a really, and we second guessed ourselves after the fact, but early on we made a decision to not ask questions related to cultural background, race or ethnicity. Yeah. But we did ask questions about gender and gender identity. So no, we can't get at some of that composition that you're interested in, and that's important, and it would be important to know going forward, to investigate that. What we did was we had, if you answered yes, my willingness to speak, or no, my willingness to speak went down, we did have some follow-up questions on why. What would you, and they could tag as many as they wanted to for reasons why, and then there was an open-ended spot. So we did get some nuance there. What I really want to dig in on now is this issue of gender, because I am fascinated that if there's a group that is resistant to dialogue, it is young men who are unnerved by not getting to talk as much. And I need to dig into that more.
Also old men as well.
We don't deal with it. But I would also add, we did in the qualitative sections, there were students who were saying, I would never normally speak.
Yeah.
And sometimes directly link that up to certain positions. My religion isn't well represented on campus. I felt like nobody had ever known who I was. And I also, because of those discussion posts, I also have some sort of off-survey responses where students were really talking about, I've always been afraid to tell anybody I'm X.
Yeah.
This let me tell somebody I'm X, and now I understand that my classmates understand me. And so that was one of the first places I got sold on this whole thing, is when I was getting those responses. And actually a student who responded that way, we were presenting on this the other day at SMU, and she described it as taking her dinner table into the classroom and vice versa. So that she comes from a minority community in a lot of ways. She's not SMU standard. But she felt so welcomed after a couple of these classes that she felt heard and understood, and also felt able to listen to classmates whom she would have shut out, and was able to talk about that opening for her own, as she put it, I listened to a football player, and he had something to say.
So let's move on to our very last question. We're already over time, so quickly.
Oh, it was just whether you looked at trusting experts through the public engagement, because I'm fascinated with the implications for public engagement with science generally. So at Bach, we've got a Pint of Science series where we go into pubs and give talks about research. It's fun, but I wonder whether a more dialogic approach would be more effective in building the rapport that enables trust to emerge to a greater extent even when there's disagreement. Trust in intentions, more or less, to say, these people are doing the best they can to unpack this question, and perhaps it's not too bad. Anyway, I'm just wondering if you have any evidence on this type of issue or outcomes from the public engagement, from the encounter series?
So in terms of the actual specialists, so in terms of our more scientific endeavors, most of our encounters are more humanistic. But in terms of our food systems and in terms of climate change, we found that to have these conversations fruitfully, you need specialists that can talk about the science. We can bring the humanities all we want, but people want a scientist in the room, sometimes a politician. But in bringing those people to the room, for instance, in climate change, you actually had to structure the question. So one thing we didn't talk about in encounters is that a lot of the training and time and effort into the slide presentations are creating a good question. And so we work with the actual scientists to say, look, we can frame climate change as, do you think it exists or not? What is the science behind it? What are the facts behind it? But we found that shut down conversation, shut down levels of trust within the room. And so we framed questions to really talk about, well, what are the values behind believing or not believing in climate change? What are the reasons why someone wouldn't believe? Maybe they work in an industry that would be gutted or destroyed, and there's no other opportunities that they see as possible. And so for us, we had to enter into the conversation not dealing with the science and facts that scientists are used to dealing with, but rather bringing that dialogue, that common grounding. What are the values we already have in the room that we can talk about this scientific issue?
So can I just
So
say,
it's,
oh, go ahead.
so I was going to say, I mean, in a way, encounters is a kind of meta exercise in attempting to build trust in experts in a moment when there is such an incredible reaction against expertise and eggheads and academics and so on and so forth, by setting them up in a way in which they don't show up and control the discourse of the room, but rather people can kind of move to the point where they feel comfortable and then enter into conversation, ask them the questions they want, and then there's the importance of the cultural setting is key too, in the sense, or sort of kind of micro community building, in the sense that we always have lunch afterwards. We have 2 hours of engagement, and then you can engage with the people. And so we did this kind of big public training and in Hartford, and folks who showed up to learn how to do encounters kind of recoiled against the language of the expert. Like, well, we don't like this idea that there's an expert, and at the end of this whole really kind of democratized conversation, why do you have to have somebody come in who then is like the Monty Python foot of possibility and like, no, this is the way it is. We said, well, but that's actually not the way that it is, right? And to not have those people in the room is actually, I think, in certain ways, to sort of continue this, or to sort of seed the ground to a kind of cultural movement that is skeptical of the expert. And so what I think we're attempting to do is allow people to approach people who have deep, deep knowledge, but they can do it kind of skeptically, right? And engage with them, and they can see people who have degrees and in a position, whatever, have to reveal what they don't know or hem and haw about something. And so in a way, actually, this is also a kind of an effort to try to increase faith in experts.
All right, well, we are 10 minutes over, so let's